I never thought something as small as a property line could consume my entire life, until the day I realized the HOA had quietly built entire homes on my land. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I mean, I had grown up there, walked those fields every summer, fished by that creek, and yet suddenly fences, driveways, and houses were creeping onto my property like some invasive weed. It started with a call from a neighbor, an older man who had lived 2 streets over longer than anyone could remember. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Kashif, have you noticed the new houses on your land?" I laughed it off at first. "What are you talking about? Those lots have always been part of the HOA development plan." But the moment I drove there, I realized it wasn't just talk. It was real. The ground where I had once planted a small orchard, where my father and I had spent endless summers, now had brand new houses with shiny mailboxes. And not just a couple, entire streets. My land, my inheritance, taken. I tried reasoning at first. I called the HOA office, asked politely for their property records. I even emailed the developer, thinking maybe it was some administrative error. But every interaction only deepened the pit in my stomach. Their smiles, their calm tone over phone. It was mocking without them even knowing. "We have our records," they said. "You must be mistaken." I wasn't mistaken. Weeks passed. Every day, I would walk the boundaries with a notebook in hand, measuring, marking, trying to document the encroachment. I took pictures. I recorded videos. Every fence, every driveway, every mailbox that crept past my rightful lines. I logged it. It was almost surreal, the audacity of it. How could they just build on someone else's land and act like it was perfectly legal? I began digging deeper into the HOA's history. Old records, municipal filings, property deeds, anything I could find. That's when I found it. A clerical error buried in layers of paperwork that had gone unnoticed for decades. That error had technically allowed the HOA to assume control of the parcels they now claimed, but legally, it was shaky at best. And then the call came that would change everything. From a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years, a family attorney who handled my grandfather's estate. "Kashif," she said slowly, as if preparing me for bad news. "You've inherited everything. All of it." For a moment, I didn't process it. "Wait, what do you mean everything?" I asked. My hands were shaking. I was standing in the middle of what they said was my land, yet now it wasn't just mine, it was mine formally. My grandfather's will, lost in bureaucratic limbo for years, had finally been executed. Everything, my land, the property, the history, was officially mine again. I wanted to scream, to celebrate, to cry. But mostly I wanted revenge. Because now, I wasn't just someone whose property had been encroached upon. I was the owner, in every legal sense, of every inch those houses sat on. Every HOA meeting I had been barred from attending. Every arrogant developer who smiled while signing contracts. I now held the power. The first step was subtle. I walked through the neighborhoods, observing the new residents. Most of them had no idea they were living on land that technically belonged to me. They had been sold a dream, a slice of suburban bliss, and in reality, they were trespassing. And yet, they weren't the enemy, not directly. The enemy was the HOA. The enemy was a system that allowed this to happen, that smiled, nodded, and profited while trampling on my family's legacy. I started keeping a journal. Every interaction, every observation, every thought about what I could do to reclaim control. Not just reclaim, but reshape. Not out of malice toward innocent residents, but out of justice. Machiavelli style, I told myself. Sometimes, to protect what is yours, you have to play by rules others don't understand. The more I explored the property, the more audacious the development seemed. Streets laid out with no regard for old trees, for the small creek that had been a secret haven of wildlife, for the orchards and gardens that had survived generations. I felt a burning mix of anger and opportunity. The HOA had been clever, underhanded even, but clever and underhanded doesn't always win. Not when the law, history, and inheritance side with you. I remember standing one afternoon at the edge of my property, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the brand new lawns. I could see the HOA president's house in the distance, a large, ugly structure that had been plopped there as a symbol of dominance, of entitlement. I clenched my fists. The first plan in my head wasn't about lawsuits or eviction notices. No, it was about leverage, power, influence, the kind of strategy that could turn the tables completely. And as I stared, I realized something profound. I hadn't just inherited property. I had inherited the power to change everything. Every decision the HOA had made, every rule they had enforced, every trespass and encroachment, they were about to face consequences they never saw coming. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold. Maybe I'd use the law. Maybe I'd negotiate. Maybe I'd find a way to make them see the absurdity of their audacity through action rather than words. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. That night, I sat down at my old desk, pulling out the blueprints, the surveys, and the inheritance papers. Every line on every page told a story, some of family, some of theft, some of arrogance, and some of potential victory. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice whispering through the papers. Take what is yours. Don't be afraid. And I wasn't afraid. I wasn't just going to reclaim what they had taken. I was going to take control in a way that left them stunned. Little did I know, the path ahead would test every ounce of patience, strategy, and cunning I had. It would pit me not just against the HOA, but against lawyers, developers, and even neighbors who unwittingly stood in my way. And it would reveal secrets about the land, about my family, and about the very system that allowed them to build on my property in the first place. But that's the story. How a quiet inheritance turned into a battlefield. How a young man, blindsided by audacity and greed, became a force the HOA never expected. How every inch of property, every fence, every mailbox, every street could become a piece of a larger game, one that was just beginning. And so, I took the first step, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The land was mine and everything on it, even if they didn't know it yet, would soon recognize it. Because inheritance isn't just about ownership, it's about power. And power, when wielded wisely, is unstoppable. The next morning felt different. I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the weight of the inheritance settling into my bones, or maybe it was a realization that for once, I wasn't powerless. I had leverage, and leverage, when used correctly, can tilt entire systems. My first destination was a county records office. The place was depressing. Flickering lights, dusty shelves, bore employees half buried behind folders. But what I needed was buried deeper than dust. I requested everything related to my family's land. Maps, surveys, old deeds, zoning approvals, development petitions. Anything that could show how the HOA had slipped through the cracks. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the amount of paperwork I requested. All of this, she asked. All of it, I repeated. Hours later, I sat at a wooden table surrounded by stacks of documents. So tall, they nearly blocked the light. And that's when the story really began to unravel. The original property lines were crystal clear. My grandfather had meticulously maintained them, even filing updated surveys every few decades. Boundaries that stretched beyond where the HOA had built. Boundaries that clearly showed the land hadn't been sold, transferred, leased, or otherwise touched. Yet the HOA's development proposal from 15 years ago showed a neat little map where my family's land had magically disappeared, replaced by blank squares designated for community expansion. No sale, no signature, no approval from any family member. Just erasure, like my grandfather didn't exist. I dug deeper, flipping through folders, cross-checking signatures, comparing dates. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some hidden deal my father made, or a clause I never knew about. But the truth hit me like a punch. Someone forged it. Someone altered county records years ago, just enough to give developers confidence to build. Not enough to be legal, but enough that no one questioned it. And it wasn't just sloppy. It was strategic, calculated. At this point, my anger wasn't even anger anymore. It was focus. Pure, cold, Machiavellian focus. I left the office with a binder full of copies and a mind full of possibilities. But before making any move, I needed to see the HOA president face to face. Not to argue, not to issue threats, but to observe. Sometimes a person's eyes reveal more truth than their words ever will. Her name was Linda Grayson, and she ruled the neighborhood like a self-appointed monarch. Her house sat at the highest point of the development, looking down, literally, on everyone else. I knocked on her polished wooden door, and after a moment, she opened it with a smile that felt stretched and artificial. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice dripping with politeness. "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm the owner of the land your homes are sitting on." The smile wavered, but only slightly. She had poker face training. I could tell. "I'm sorry," I said. I repeated, "I own the land. All of it. Every foundation. Every driveway. Every street your HOA claims jurisdiction over is built on my property." For a moment, she flickered, like a glitch in a simulation. She recovered quickly. "Well, that must be a misunderstanding. Our records." "Your records are forged," I said, letting the words land. Her posture straightened. "Forged is a strong accusation. So is building 47 homes on land you don't own." A long silence followed. She assessed me, her eyes narrowing just enough to betray the emotion she was trying to hide. Fear, not of me, but of exposure, embarrassment, liability, loss, power slipping from her hands. "I'll have my legal team review this," she finally said. "You do that," I replied, "and send them to my attorney when they're ready." I walked away without giving her time to respond. Sometimes the strongest move is exiting before the other person gathers control. Back home, I spread the documents across my living room floor. One thing was clear. If I wanted justice, I'd need more than words, more than anger. I needed a strategy that attacked from every angle: legal, financial, political, and psychological. The first big break came 3 days later. My attorney, Ms. Rivera, called while practically laughing. "You're going to love this," she said. It turned out the land's mineral rights were still active. Decades ago, they were worthless. But not anymore. A new environmental zoning rule meant that if someone owned both surface and subsurface rights, any development required their explicit permission. And guess who owned both? Not the HOA, not the developers. Me. I stared at the mineral rights filing in my hands and couldn't help but grin. They didn't just build on my land. They built on land whose legal certifications I controlled completely. That meant retroactive violations, fines, injunctions, and the possibility of shutting down the entire HOA on paper. The next step was gathering allies. Not all HOA residents were my enemies. Many of them hated the HOA, hated the rules, hated the fines, hated being told what color to paint their mailbox. They weren't loyal soldiers. They were tired prisoners. And tired prisoners make fantastic allies. I walked door to door, introducing myself not as an enemy, but as the rightful landowner trying to fix the mess caused by corrupt HOA leadership. Most people were surprisingly receptive. One woman even hugged me, saying she'd been fined 3 separate times for having non-regulation roses. The more conversations I had, the more I realized the HOA wasn't just unjust to me. It was unjust to everyone living under it. And that was the pressure point I needed. By the end of the week, I had dozens of residents willing to testify, sign affidavits, or simply support the cause. If things escalated, and they would, I'd have numbers on my side. But the real turning point came unexpectedly. While reviewing old land surveys, I discovered something strange. An old well on the southeastern corner of the property. A well that, according to state law, created a unique protective boundary. A boundary that invalidated any development within a certain radius unless special permits were filed. Permits the HOA had never applied for. It meant 43 of the houses were out of compliance. 43. Not a small mistake. Not a minor oversight. A catastrophic legal flaw that could collapse the entire development like a domino chain. I sat there staring at the blueprints, realizing just how deep the negligence went. The HOA, in their arrogance, had been building blindly, confident, untouchable. They never imagined someone would go digging through the past. They never imagined someone would uncover the truth buried beneath their shortcuts and forged documents. But I wasn't done. I couldn't be. Not when I had evidence that could rewrite the entire story. That night, as I walked the quiet streets of the neighborhood, my neighborhood, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was planning. This wasn't about reclaiming land. It was about correcting a wrong so massive it felt unreal. As porch lights flicked on one by one, I realized how peaceful everything looked. Kids' bikes laying on lawns. The smell of someone grilling dinner. Dogs barking in backyards. People living their lives completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to shift. Not because of me, but because of the truth. The HOA had built on lies. And sooner or later, lies collapse under their own weight. And I was going to make sure that collapse was strategic, clean, controlled. The next phase was coming. And it wouldn't be quiet. The next morning, I woke up with a plan that felt almost surgical in its precision. The HOA hadn't just trespassed on my land. They had built an entire empire on assumptions, arrogance, and outdated paperwork. And every empire has a weak point. I had found theirs. First, I started documenting everything in meticulous detail. Not just boundaries and surveys, but photographs of every street sign, every mailbox, every fence post. I walked the property repeatedly, taking GPS coordinates and creating digital overlays with old maps. It was tedious work, but by the time I finished, I had a map that proved without question that the HOA had built entire homes illegally. Not a single inch of guesswork, no gray area, no, maybe this is ours. It was all mine. Next, I needed leverage. And leverage comes in many forms: financial, legal, social, even psychological. I began researching past HOA disputes, uncovering patterns. There were complaints about mismanagement, fines, rules enforced arbitrarily, emails from residents begging for relief, letters ignored, petitions buried. Each one added to the mountain of evidence against them. Then came the psychological angle. I started sending letters, not threats, not demands, just reminders, gentle nudges that made the HOA leadership question their own foundations. You may want to review the property records. I wrote, there appear to be discrepancies regarding the land your homes are built on. I didn't mention fines or lawsuits. I didn't need to. The uncertainty was enough to make them squirm. And squirm they did. The first real sign came during a board meeting. I didn't attend in person. Far too obvious. But I had a friend secretly record it. The president's confident tone faltered. Directors exchanged uneasy glances when my name was mentioned. Even the youngest board member looked pale. That's when I knew. They realized the game had changed. I escalated quietly. One by one, I contacted residents who had been vocal critics of the HOA. I didn't tell them everything. I never want to create panic. But I explained enough. I own the land, I said. I'm in the process of reviewing the development permits. You may have more rights than you realize. Many were stunned, others relieved. Some were skeptical, but all were curious. Then came the breakthrough. One of the older residents mentioned a loophole I hadn't seen before. It was small, obscure, buried in a zoning regulation from the 1970s, but it was perfect. If I filed the right paperwork, it would force a halt to all current developments immediately. That meant no new construction, no renovations, no landscaping projects, nothing. Suddenly, the HOA's control was frozen. I filed the paperwork the very next day. The response came faster than expected. A notice from the city planning department confirmed a temporary halt on all projects. It wasn't permanent, but it was enough to give me breathing room. Enough to strategize my next moves without them bulldozing more of my land. But legal leverage was only part of the plan. I needed public pressure. The HOA thrived on appearances, on the illusion of order and compliance. A single story in the local news could unravel that carefully constructed image. So I reached out to a journalist I had met years ago, someone hungry for a story about corruption and power. I laid out the facts, sent them the photographs, the maps, the legal documents. Within a week, a reporter called, excited and horrified in equal measure. "This is massive," she said. "People need to see this. Do you want to go on record?" I agreed, carefully crafting my words. I wasn't there to vilify residents, only to expose a system that had been exploiting them and me for decades. The article went live 2 days later. The headline alone made my chest tighten. HOA builds homes on land they don't own. Local resident fights back. The response was instantaneous. Calls from neighbors, texts from old friends, even a few confused emails from strangers who had read the article. The HOA leadership panicked. Board meetings became frantic. Their previous confidence evaporated. Rumors spread about possible lawsuits, media scrutiny, and, worst of all for them, internal dissent. I watched it unfold from a distance, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. Every step had to be calculated, precise. I wasn't interested in chaos. I was interested in reclaiming what was mine and correcting the injustices done to generations before me. And then the real confrontation began. Linda Grayson, the HOA president, finally reached out. Her tone was formal, polite, but I could hear the tension underneath every word. "We need to discuss this matter," she wrote. "Perhaps we can reach an amicable resolution." I smiled at the email. Amicable wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but I responded professionally, agreeing to a meeting at a neutral location. I wanted witnesses, I wanted records, and most importantly, I wanted to control the environment. The day of the meeting, I arrived early. I had copies of every document, every map, every photo. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to demonstrate inevitability. When Linda and her board arrived, they carried their usual air of arrogance, but it faltered under my calm, prepared presence. I laid out the facts methodically. Every development built on my property, every violation, every oversight, every loophole ignored. I let silence punctuate the room after each revelation. Their discomfort was palpable. Their attempt to counter with vague statements or procedural excuses fell flat. I had anticipated every argument, every denial, every deflection. By the end of the meeting, the room was quiet. Not a single member spoke. They couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal footing clear, and the public scrutiny unavoidable. And yet, the battle wasn't over. I had won a critical advantage. But the HOA was a deeply entrenched system. They would fight back in subtle ways. Small lawsuits, procedural delays, internal propaganda. I knew I had to anticipate every move, stay several steps ahead, and never show weakness. Back at home, I reviewed my plan. Step 1, legal and regulatory leverage. Done. Step 2, public and community pressure. Done. Step 3, internal negotiation and strategic concessions. About to begin. Step 4, reclaiming full operational control of the property. The ultimate goal. Every night, I pored over the documents again, analyzing every clause, every boundary, every precedent. I wasn't just fighting for property. I was fighting for legacy, for justice, for respect. And I realized something important. This wasn't just a legal battle or a personal vendetta. It was a test of patience, cunning, and endurance. The stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. The HOA was desperate, cunning, and ruthless. But so was I. And unlike them, I had something they could never take: rightful ownership, meticulous preparation, and a clear vision of the outcome. As the sun set over the neighborhood, I walked through my property once more. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. The streets hummed with life, and the homes gleamed under fading light. But I saw them differently now, not as obstacles, not as intrusions, but as pieces of a puzzle I was slowly, methodically solving. I whispered to myself, almost as a promise, this ends with justice. Not chaos, not revenge for its own sake. Justice. And with that promise, I began the final phase of my plan. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but it would be decisive. And by the time it was over, the HOA would finally understand what happens when you build on someone else's land, ignore the law, and underestimate the rightful owner. The days following the meeting were a tense dance. The HOA attempted minor maneuvers, sending vague notices, pushing procedural delays, but I had anticipated every move. I stayed calm, collected, and deliberate. Every phone call, every email, every interaction was carefully documented. I wasn't just responding. I was creating a paper trail that could withstand scrutiny at every level. I also intensified my community outreach. People had begun whispering, gossiping, sharing the story from the article. Residents I hadn't spoken to before came forward, offering support, stories of fines and infractions, and even old photographs of property before the HOA had built their homes. Every piece of evidence strengthened my position. I realized the HOA had underestimated the power of the community. When the truth is undeniable, allies multiply quickly. Then came the call from the city planning department. They had reviewed my filings and cross-checked them against current development permits. The results were staggering. Not only were many of the homes in violation of zoning laws, but several roads, fences, and utility lines had been constructed without proper authorization. The HOA had assumed compliance without verification, leaving them vulnerable. I shared the findings with my attorney, who confirmed the next step. A series of formal notices and fines could be issued immediately, effectively putting the HOA on the defensive. And that's exactly what we did. Each notice was precise, leaving no room for interpretation. We didn't threaten, we didn't exaggerate. We simply presented the facts. The effect was immediate. The HOA's leadership began panicking behind closed doors. Internal emails leaked, revealing confusion and fear. Board members argued among themselves, each blaming the other for failing to notice the legal vulnerabilities. The facade of control they had maintained for years was crumbling. I didn't stop there. I strategically approached residents whose homes were affected by the violations. I offered guidance, legal insight, and reassurance. Unlike the HOA, I wasn't there to punish them. I was there to empower them with knowledge, to help them understand that they had rights, that they had options, and that I was committed to protecting those rights. This approach had a dual effect. Not only did it build trust and support within the community, but also further isolated the HOA leadership. Their power depended on the perception of absolute control. As more residents aligned with me, that perception began to evaporate. The first major confrontation came when Linda Grayson attempted to challenge the fines in court. She was confident, arrogant even, assuming she could intimidate the judge with her charm and fabricated records. But the evidence was overwhelming. Surveys, historical deeds, zoning violations, and affidavits from residents formed an airtight case. The court didn't just side with me. It reinforced the authority of rightful ownership in a way that left the HOA scrambling for credibility. One by one, the violations were corrected, fines were imposed, and compliance measures were enforced. The HOA leadership scrambled to regain control, but each move only deepened their exposure. Their previous actions, once hidden behind bureaucracy and assumed authority, were now public knowledge. I also discovered an unexpected layer of advantage. Some HOA board members had personally benefited from the legal developments, luxury upgrades, exclusive access, preferential contracts. They had violated their own bylaws. This provided additional leverage. I didn't exploit it maliciously. I used it strategically, highlighting legal accountability rather than vengeance. The neighborhood began to transform under my influence. Streets were realigned legally, utilities properly registered, and homeowners empowered to make informed decisions about their property. The HOA, once a domineering force, became a regulated entity, constrained by law, transparency, and accountability. And then came the ultimate moment. I approached the HOA board with a proposal. I would formalize ownership and boundaries, ensuring the community could thrive without fear of arbitrary control, as long as the rules were clear and legal. In exchange, the HOA would acknowledge the corrected property lines and submit to oversight. It was a delicate negotiation, but one I had prepared for meticulously. I had anticipated every objection, every emotional appeal, every attempt at manipulation. By the time we concluded the meeting, the HOA had agreed. My authority was recognized. The property boundaries were legally enforced, and the residents had clarity and protection. Walking to the neighborhood afterward, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not for revenge, not for power, but for justice restored. Every fence, every driveway, every home now existed with legitimacy. The community could thrive, and my family's legacy was honored. I also knew this wasn't just about land. It was about principle, foresight, and courage. about standing up when everyone assumed compliance, when the system favored the bold and unscrupulous. It was about using power responsibly, strategically, and with vision. Months later, the neighborhood had transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. Residents who had once feared the HOA now engaged in community decisions. Transparency replaced secrecy. Authority was balanced with accountability. And I walked through it all knowing that the inheritance I had received wasn't just land. It was the power to reshape a system that had long been corrupt. Looking back, the experience had changed me. It wasn't about vengeance or spite. It was about understanding the intricate dance between power and responsibility. It was about recognizing opportunities, acting decisively, and using knowledge as a tool for justice. The HOA had assumed that construction, bureaucracy, and arrogance could silence rightful ownership. They were wrong. Every misstep they made, every assumption they held, every shortcut they took became a pathway for correction. As I stood on the hill overlooking the neighborhood one last time, I thought about the journey. From confusion, anger, and disbelief to strategy, execution, and resolution. It had been a battle of wits, patience, and endurance. And in the end, the truth had prevailed. The homes remained, but the foundation was finally correct, not just legally, but morally. Residents were informed, empowered, and protected. The HOA leadership, once untouchable, had been held accountable. And I had learned that true power isn't in destruction, but in restoring balance, enforcing fairness, and navigating complexity with clarity and precision. Inheritance, I realized, isn't just about possession. It's about responsibility, strategy, and vision. And when wielded correctly, it transforms more than property. It transforms entire communities. As the sun set over the streets that had once been a battleground, I knew this story was over, but its lessons would linger. The land was mine. The neighborhood was secure, and the HOA would never underestimate rightful ownership again. Justice had been served, not with chaos or spite, but with strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve. And as I walked through quiet streets, I couldn't help but smile. This was the inheritance I had truly claimed.